Question 1. Which approach would be most consistent with Alabama's legal framework for cultural heritage preservation when a proposed commercial development threatens an area with known historical significance? Option A. Focus exclusively on the preservation of any standing historic structures, disregarding archaeological potential or intangible cultural practices associated with the land. Option B. Rely on informal discussions with longtime residents to gauge the perceived historical importance of the area, without formal documentation or consultation with official heritage bodies. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive archaeological and historical survey to identify and document all tangible and intangible cultural heritage elements. Engage with local communities and descendant groups to understand their connection to the site, and develop mitigation strategies in consultation with the Alabama Historical Commission. Option D. Prioritize the economic viability of the development, proceeding with construction after a cursory review of readily visible historical markers, assuming minimal impact on the broader cultural heritage. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive archaeological and historical survey to identify and document all tangible and intangible cultural heritage elements. Engage with local communities and descendant groups to understand their connection to the site, and develop mitigation strategies in consultation with the Alabama Historical Commission. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the preservation of historical integrity with the practical needs of a modern community. The Alabama Historical Commission's mandate under the Code of Alabama Title 41, Chapter 8, Preservation of Historical and Archaeological Sites, emphasizes the identification, acquisition, and preservation of sites and objects of historical significance. The challenge lies in interpreting cultural heritage as a legal concept, which extends beyond mere physical artifacts to encompass the intangible aspects of a community's past and its connection to the land. Careful judgment is required to ensure that development does not irrevocably damage or erase this heritage. The best approach involves a comprehensive assessment that legally defines and quantifies the cultural heritage significance of the proposed development area. This includes identifying tangible elements like archaeological sites, historic structures, and significant landscapes, as well as intangible elements such as traditional land use patterns, oral histories, and community memory associated with the site. This approach aligns with the Alabama Historical Commission's duty to protect sites and objects of historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural significance. It necessitates engaging with local communities and stakeholders to understand their connection to the heritage, thereby fulfilling the spirit of preservation laws that aim to safeguard Alabama's unique historical identity for future generations. An approach that prioritizes immediate economic benefits over a thorough heritage assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate the Code of Alabama Title 41, Chapter 8, by failing to adequately consider or protect sites and objects of historical or cultural significance. Such an approach risks irreversible damage to irreplaceable heritage, leading to potential legal challenges and public outcry. Another unacceptable approach would be to focus solely on easily identifiable physical structures, while neglecting less visible but equally important cultural heritage, such as traditional agricultural practices or sacred sites recognized by local indigenous communities. This narrow interpretation of cultural heritage would fail to meet the comprehensive preservation goals outlined in Alabama law, which implicitly recognizes the multifaceted nature of historical and cultural value. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinions about the site's heritage, without rigorous documentation or consultation with relevant experts and stakeholders, would be professionally deficient. This lacks the systematic and legally defensible basis required for heritage management decisions under Alabama law, potentially leading to the overlooking or mischaracterization of significant cultural resources. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the legal definition of cultural heritage within Alabama. This involves consulting the Code of Alabama, particularly Title 41, Chapter 8, and any relevant administrative rules from the Alabama Historical Commission. The process should include thorough research, expert consultation, archaeologists, historians, cultural anthropologists, stakeholder engagement, including descendant communities, and a detailed impact assessment that quantifies both the cultural heritage values and the potential impacts of the proposed development. Mitigation strategies should be developed in consultation with stakeholders and in accordance with legal requirements. Question 2. Investigation of potential impacts on Alabama's intangible cultural heritage due to a proposed large-scale infrastructure project. What approach best aligns with the principles of the UNESCO Convention for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage and Alabama's commitment to its implementation? Option A. Conduct a review of existing historical site designations and archaeological surveys to identify any tangible links to intangible cultural heritage, assuming that these existing records are sufficient for understanding and protecting living traditions. Option B. Develop a set of standardized safeguarding measures based on general best practices for cultural heritage preservation and present them to community leaders for approval, without prior in-depth consultation or collaborative development. Option C. Proceed with the infrastructure project based on economic feasibility studies, considering intangible cultural heritage only if it presents a direct and significant obstacle to construction, and then seeking minimal mitigation measures. Option D. Initiate direct engagement with the communities identified as bearers of relevant intangible cultural heritage to collaboratively identify and document their living traditions, assess potential impacts, and co-develop culturally appropriate safeguarding measures that can be integrated into the project's environmental and social impact assessments. The correct answer is D. Initiate direct engagement with the communities identified as bearers of relevant intangible cultural heritage to collaboratively identify and document their living traditions, assess potential impacts, and co-develop culturally appropriate safeguarding measures that can be integrated into the project's environmental and social impact assessments. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between economic development and the preservation of intangible cultural heritage. Alabama, like other states, must navigate the complexities of identifying, safeguarding, and transmitting living cultural expressions, while also considering the practicalities of land use and resource management. The Alabama Historical Commission, tasked with overseeing such matters, must balance these competing interests, requiring careful judgment to ensure compliance with both national and international frameworks, particularly the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, which Alabama has ratified. The challenge lies in translating the broad principles of the convention into concrete actions that respect the rights and practices of communities, while also allowing for necessary societal progress. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a proactive and community-centered strategy that aligns directly with the principles of the UNESCO Convention. This approach prioritizes the identification and documentation of intangible cultural heritage elements by engaging directly with the communities who are the bearers of this heritage. It emphasizes collaborative development of safeguarding measures, ensuring that these measures are culturally appropriate and sustainable, and that they respect the wishes and knowledge of the community. This aligns with Article 7 of the Convention, which calls for the participation of communities in the safeguarding of their own intangible cultural heritage. Furthermore, it involves integrating these heritage considerations into broader land use planning and development processes, thereby preventing potential conflicts and ensuring that development does not inadvertently harm or erase these vital cultural expressions. This holistic and participatory method is the most effective way to fulfill Alabama's obligations under the Convention. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on existing historical site designations without actively seeking community input or considering living traditions. This fails to recognize that intangible cultural heritage is dynamic and community-based, not solely tied to physical structures. It neglects the core principle of the UNESCO Convention, which is the safeguarding of living heritage. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize immediate economic development over any potential impact on intangible cultural heritage, assuming that such heritage is not a significant factor in land use decisions. This approach is ethically and legally flawed, as it disregards the international commitments Alabama has made and the intrinsic value of cultural heritage. It risks irreversible loss of cultural practices and knowledge. A third incorrect approach would be to implement safeguarding measures without consulting the communities concerned, imposing external definitions or solutions. This undermines the principle of community ownership and participation, which is fundamental to the convention's success, and can lead to ineffective or even detrimental outcomes for the heritage itself. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama tasked with managing cultural heritage and development should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the UNESCO Convention for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage and its implications for state-level practice. This framework should mandate early and continuous engagement with communities identified as bearers of intangible cultural heritage. It requires integrating heritage impact assessments into all relevant planning and development processes, ensuring that potential risks to intangible cultural heritage are identified and mitigated. Furthermore, it necessitates the development of culturally sensitive and community-driven safeguarding plans, supported by adequate resources and expertise. This proactive, collaborative, and rights-based approach ensures that both development and cultural preservation can coexist responsibly. Question 3. When considering the acquisition of a potentially significant cultural artifact within Alabama, what is the most prudent and legally compliant approach to ensure the object's provenance and avoid contravening the principles of the UNIDROIT Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects? Option A. Prioritize the object's artistic and historical significance, assuming its presence in Alabama implies legal acquisition. Option B. Conduct thorough due diligence to verify the object's legal provenance, including obtaining documentation of its lawful export from its country of origin and legal import into the United States and Alabama. Option C. Accept the seller's verbal assurances regarding the object's history and ownership, provided the seller appears reputable. Option D. Proceed with the acquisition if the object is not explicitly listed on any international stolen art databases, without further investigation into its export or import history. The correct answer is B. Conduct thorough due diligence to verify the object's legal provenance, including obtaining documentation of its lawful export from its country of origin and legal import into the United States and Alabama. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential conflict between acquiring a valuable artifact and adhering to international and state-level legal obligations concerning cultural heritage. The difficulty lies in discerning the legitimate provenance of an object when presented with a seemingly straightforward transaction, requiring diligence to avoid complicity in the illicit trafficking of cultural property. Alabama, like many states, has an interest in protecting its cultural heritage and is subject to international conventions that aim to prevent the unlawful movement of such items. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting thorough due diligence to verify the object's provenance and legal export status. This approach requires actively seeking documentation that demonstrates the object was legally excavated, owned, and exported from its country of origin, and that it was legally imported into the United States and subsequently into Alabama. This includes examining export permits, ownership records, and any relevant historical documentation. This approach aligns with the principles of the UNIDROIT Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects, which aims to facilitate the recovery and return of cultural property that has been stolen or illegally exported. Alabama law, in conjunction with federal statutes and international agreements, mandates that individuals and institutions act with reasonable care to ensure they are not acquiring cultural property that has been illicitly removed from its source country. Incorrect approaches analysis, relying solely on the seller's assurances without independent verification, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to meet the standard of due diligence required by ethical practice and the spirit of international conventions like UNIDROIT. It risks acquiring stolen or illegally exported cultural property, potentially leading to legal repercussions and reputational damage. Accepting the object based on its apparent age and artistic merit, without investigating its legal status, is also professionally unsound. While aesthetic and historical value are important considerations for cultural objects, they do not supersede legal provenance. This approach ignores the fundamental requirement to ensure the object's lawful presence, assuming that because the object is being offered for sale within Alabama, it must have a legal provenance is a dangerous assumption. This overlooks the possibility of illegal export from another country and subsequent illegal import into the United States and Alabama. The burden of proof for legal provenance rests with the acquirer, not the state. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with cultural objects must adopt a proactive and investigative mindset. The decision-making process should begin with an assumption of caution. When presented with an object, the first step is to inquire about its history and provenance. If the information provided is insufficient or raises any red flags, further independent investigation is mandatory. This involves consulting experts, researching historical records, and verifying any provided documentation. The Unidroit Convention and relevant state and federal laws provide a framework for this due diligence, emphasizing the importance of preventing the market for illicitly traded cultural property. Professionals must prioritize legal compliance and ethical acquisition over the potential acquisition of a valuable but illegally obtained artifact. Question 4. Benchmark analysis indicates that a private collector in Alabama has acquired an artifact of unknown origin and potential historical significance. The collector wishes to sell this artifact internationally. What is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama's cultural heritage legal framework and international obligations? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of Alabama's code, particularly Title 41, Chapter 10, Article 1, Alabama Historical Commission Act, and relevant federal laws. Consult with the Alabama Historical Commission and seek legal counsel specializing in cultural property law to determine the artifact's status and any applicable export or transfer regulations. Option B. Prioritize the potential financial return from the international sale, proceeding with the transaction as quickly as possible to capitalize on market demand, without extensive legal or regulatory review. Option C. Assume that because the artifact was privately owned and found on private land, it is automatically exempt from any heritage protection laws in Alabama, and proceed with the sale without further investigation. Option D. Proceed with the international sale, relying on the buyer's assurances of legitimate acquisition and the absence of explicit state prohibitions, assuming private ownership exempts the artifact from heritage regulations. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of Alabama's code, particularly Title 41, Chapter 10, Article 1, Alabama Historical Commission Act, and relevant federal laws. Consult with the Alabama Historical Commission and seek legal counsel specializing in cultural property law to determine the artifact's status and any applicable export or transfer regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between national heritage protection laws and international trade agreements, particularly when dealing with artifacts of potential cultural significance. Navigating these competing legal frameworks requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's specific cultural heritage statutes and their interaction with federal and international obligations. Careful judgment is essential to avoid legal repercussions and to uphold ethical responsibilities towards preserving cultural patrimony. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of Alabama's code, specifically Title 41, Chapter 10, Article 1, Alabama Historical Commission Act, and any relevant federal legislation such as the National Historic Preservation Act, to determine the artifact's status and the legal requirements for its export or transfer. This approach prioritizes compliance with established legal frameworks, ensuring that any disposition of the artifact adheres to both state and federal mandates regarding the protection and management of cultural heritage. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in cultural property law and the Alabama Historical Commission is a critical component of this best practice, providing expert guidance and ensuring all procedural requirements are met. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the sale based solely on the buyer's assurances of legitimate acquisition and the absence of explicit state prohibition, without conducting due diligence into Alabama's specific heritage laws. This fails to acknowledge the proactive duty to investigate potential heritage significance and compliance requirements. Such an oversight could lead to the unwitting violation of Alabama's code, which may impose reporting or approval obligations for artifacts deemed to be of historical or archaeological importance, even if not explicitly listed as a protected item. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize the potential financial gain from the sale over the legal and ethical obligations to protect cultural heritage. This demonstrates a disregard for the principles enshrined in Alabama's heritage laws, which are designed to safeguard the state's historical and cultural resources for public benefit. Acting solely on market demand without considering the legal provenance and potential heritage value of the artifact is a significant ethical and legal failing. Finally, assuming that because the artifact was privately owned and found on private land, it is automatically exempt from any heritage protection laws is a dangerous assumption. Alabama law, like many jurisdictions, may have provisions that extend protection to certain types of artifacts regardless of their discovery location or initial ownership, especially if they possess significant historical or archaeological value. This approach neglects the possibility of broader legal protections that might apply. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with identifying all potentially applicable legal frameworks, both at the state, Alabama, and federal levels. This involves proactive research into heritage protection statutes, consultation with relevant state agencies, like the Alabama Historical Commission, and seeking expert legal advice when dealing with items of potential cultural or historical significance. A risk-based assessment, prioritizing compliance and ethical stewardship, should guide all actions concerning cultural heritage items. Question 5. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess the cultural significance of a historic property in rural Alabama, considering the potential for both physical structures and associated community practices to contribute to its heritage value. Which of the following assessment strategies best ensures a comprehensive understanding and protection of the site's cultural heritage? Option A. Prioritize the recording of oral histories and the documentation of traditional crafts practiced by the local community, as these represent the living heritage of the area. Option B. Conduct a detailed architectural survey of all standing structures and document any associated oral histories or traditional practices that are directly linked to the site's historical use. Option C. Undertake a preliminary assessment of potential preservation costs, and if deemed too high, limit the evaluation to a brief visual inspection of the most prominent physical features. Option D. Focus exclusively on the structural integrity and historical architectural style of the main homestead, as this is the most visible and tangible representation of the property's past. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed architectural survey of all standing structures and document any associated oral histories or traditional practices that are directly linked to the site's historical use. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a common challenge in cultural heritage management in Alabama, distinguishing between tangible and intangible heritage when assessing the significance and protection needs of a historical site. This scenario is professionally challenging because the interconnectedness of tangible structures and the intangible practices associated with them can lead to incomplete or inaccurate preservation strategies if not properly identified and addressed. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all facets of cultural heritage are considered. The best approach involves a comprehensive assessment that explicitly identifies and documents both the tangible elements of the historic site, such as the physical structures and artifacts, and the intangible elements, such as the traditional crafts, oral histories, or community rituals that are intrinsically linked to the site's existence and meaning. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of holistic cultural heritage preservation, recognizing that the value of a site often derives from the interplay between its physical manifestations and the living traditions it embodies. Alabama law, while primarily focused on the protection of tangible historic properties, implicitly supports the consideration of intangible heritage when it contributes to the historical significance and public understanding of a site. By documenting both, preservationists can advocate for more robust protection measures that encompass the full cultural value. An approach that focuses solely on the architectural integrity of the physical buildings, neglecting the associated community traditions and historical narratives, is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from an incomplete understanding of cultural heritage, leading to a potential loss of the site's full significance and its connection to living communities. Such an approach risks overlooking the very essence of why the site is culturally important, thereby failing to meet the broader objectives of heritage preservation. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize the documentation of intangible heritage, such as oral histories, without adequately assessing the condition and preservation needs of the tangible structures that house or are central to these traditions. While intangible heritage is vital, its preservation is often dependent on the survival of the physical context. Neglecting the tangible elements can lead to the eventual disappearance of the physical anchors for these intangible practices, rendering them more vulnerable. Finally, an approach that dismisses the need for detailed documentation of either tangible or intangible elements due to perceived resource limitations is also professionally unacceptable. While resource constraints are a reality, they do not excuse a failure to identify and assess the full scope of cultural heritage. Ethical and professional standards require a diligent effort to document and understand heritage, even if subsequent preservation actions must be phased or prioritized. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the definitions and scope of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage, as understood within the context of Alabama's historical and cultural landscape. This involves conducting site-specific research that includes historical records, community engagement, and expert consultation to identify all relevant heritage values. The next step is to develop an integrated assessment plan that addresses both physical structures and living traditions. Finally, preservation strategies should be formulated to protect and interpret the site holistically, ensuring that the interconnectedness of tangible and intangible elements is recognized and managed. Question 6. Process analysis reveals that a construction project in Mobile, Alabama, has unearthed several artifacts. A local historian suggests that some of these items are of significant historical interest to the state. Considering the Alabama Cultural Heritage Law exam's focus, what is the most appropriate professional approach to determine the legal status and subsequent handling of these unearthed items? Option A. Classify all unearthed items of significant age or local historical interest as cultural property, regardless of specific legal definitions, to ensure their preservation based on their perceived historical value. Option B. Rely on the local historian's assessment of historical interest to guide the handling of the items, assuming their expertise is sufficient to determine their legal status as cultural property under Alabama law. Option C. Prioritize the immediate assessment of the commercial or personal value of the unearthed items, as their market worth may dictate the most appropriate handling and disposition under Alabama law. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the unearthed items against the specific definitions and criteria for cultural property, as defined within the Alabama Code, consulting state historical commissions or archaeological experts as needed for accurate classification, and to ensure compliance with all applicable state statutes. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the unearthed items against the specific definitions and criteria for cultural property, as defined within the Alabama Code, consulting state historical commissions or archaeological experts as needed for accurate classification, and to ensure compliance with all applicable state statutes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires distinguishing between items that are merely old or historically significant and those that meet the legal definition of cultural property under Alabama law, which carries specific protections and obligations. Misclassification can lead to the improper disposal or neglect of items with significant cultural heritage value, or conversely, the unnecessary burden of managing items that do not fall under strict legal protection. Careful judgment is required to apply the legal definitions accurately to tangible artifacts. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous review of the discovered items against the specific definitions and criteria outlined in the Alabama Code concerning cultural property. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and the preservation of items legally designated as cultural property. It requires understanding that cultural property is a legal designation, not just a descriptor of age or historical interest. This involves consulting relevant sections of the Alabama Code, such as those pertaining to archaeological sites and artifacts, and potentially engaging with state historical commissions or archaeological experts to confirm the classification of specific items. This ensures that actions taken are consistent with the state's intent to protect its unique heritage. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any item of significant age or local historical interest automatically qualifies as cultural property. This fails to recognize that Alabama law has specific criteria for what constitutes cultural property, often tied to its archaeological, historical, or artistic significance to the state. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize immediate commercial or personal value over legal classification. This overlooks the ethical and legal responsibilities associated with potentially valuable cultural heritage items, which may be subject to state ownership or specific handling requirements regardless of their market worth. Finally, an approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or popular understanding of heritage without consulting the relevant Alabama statutes is insufficient. This can lead to misinterpretations of the law and the potential mishandling of protected items. Professional reasoning. Professionals encountering such items should adopt a systematic approach. First, they must identify the relevant legal framework, which in this case is Alabama's cultural heritage and property laws. Second, they should meticulously compare the characteristics of the discovered items against the statutory definitions of cultural property. This may involve research, consultation with legal counsel specializing in cultural property law, or seeking guidance from state agencies responsible for historical preservation. Third, they must document their findings and the basis for their classification. This ensures transparency and accountability. The overarching principle is to err on the side of caution and legal compliance when dealing with items that may possess cultural heritage significance. Question 7. Strategic planning requires Alabama's State Historic Preservation Office to consider its role in safeguarding cultural heritage. Given the United States' ratification of international treaties concerning the protection of cultural and natural heritage, which of the following approaches best ensures Alabama's compliance and proactive engagement with these global commitments? Option A. Rely exclusively on existing Alabama state statutes for heritage protection, assuming federal treaty ratification adequately covers state-level implementation. Option B. Assume that federal treaty ratification automatically mandates effective protection at the state level without any need for state-specific review or adaptation. Option C. Proactively research and integrate relevant international treaty provisions into Alabama's cultural heritage management policies and practices, ensuring alignment with U.S. treaty obligations. Option D. Prioritize immediate economic development projects over potential international heritage concerns, unless explicitly prohibited by Alabama state law. The correct answer is C. Proactively research and integrate relevant international treaty provisions into Alabama's cultural heritage management policies and practices, ensuring alignment with U.S. treaty obligations. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a nuanced understanding of how international legal frameworks interact with state-specific heritage protection laws in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the obligations undertaken by the United States under international treaties with the practical implementation and enforcement of those obligations within Alabama's unique cultural heritage landscape. Careful judgment is required to ensure that state-level actions are not only compliant with federal law, but also uphold the spirit and letter of international commitments. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying and integrating relevant international treaty provisions into Alabama's cultural heritage management strategies. This means Alabama's state agencies and heritage professionals should actively research and understand treaties to which the U.S. is a signatory, such as the UNESCO Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, and assess their implications for state-level policies and practices. This approach ensures that Alabama's heritage protection efforts are aligned with its international responsibilities, fostering a comprehensive and forward-thinking strategy that respects both national sovereignty and global heritage preservation goals. This aligns with the ethical imperative to act with due diligence and to promote the safeguarding of cultural heritage for future generations, as often espoused in international conventions and best practice guidelines for heritage management. An approach that solely relies on existing Alabama state statutes without considering the overarching international obligations is professionally deficient. While state laws are paramount within their jurisdiction, they must operate within the framework of federal law, which includes the ratification and implementation of international treaties. Failing to consider international commitments could lead to actions that, while technically compliant with state law, might contravene U.S. obligations under international agreements, potentially leading to international criticism or legal challenges. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that federal ratification of a treaty automatically translates into effective protection at the state level without any further action or integration. International treaty obligations often require domestic implementing legislation or policy adjustments, without actively assessing and, where necessary, adapting state-level practices to reflect treaty requirements. Alabama may inadvertently fall short of its international commitments, even with good intentions. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate economic development over potential international heritage concerns, without a thorough assessment of treaty implications, is ethically and professionally unsound. International heritage conventions often emphasize the intrinsic value of cultural heritage and the need for its protection, even when development pressures exist. A responsible approach requires a balanced consideration of all factors, informed by an understanding of international obligations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable legal and ethical obligations, both domestic and international. This involves thorough research into relevant treaties and conventions, followed by an assessment of their impact on state-level policies and practices. A proactive and integrated approach, where international commitments inform and enhance state-level heritage management, is crucial for ensuring robust and responsible stewardship of Alabama's cultural heritage. Question 8. The audit findings indicate a potential acquisition of an artifact with significant historical ties to the region, but its provenance is not fully documented. Considering Alabama's obligations under the UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and ethical practice? Option A. Proactively engage with the Alabama Historical Commission and consult with legal counsel specializing in cultural heritage law to verify the artifact's origin and export history. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition based on the seller's assurances of legitimate provenance, assuming the transaction within Alabama is inherently lawful. Option C. Prioritize the potential historical significance and financial value of the artifact, addressing legal and ethical concerns only if they become apparent during the transaction. Option D. Assume the artifact is compliant with all relevant laws simply because it is being offered for sale within the state of Alabama. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with the Alabama Historical Commission and consult with legal counsel specializing in cultural heritage law to verify the artifact's origin and export history. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves navigating the complexities of international cultural property law, specifically the UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, within the context of Alabama's specific legal framework. The challenge lies in ensuring that any proposed acquisition or transfer of potentially significant cultural property adheres strictly to both international obligations and state-level implementation, which may involve nuanced interpretations and procedural requirements. Failure to do so could result in legal penalties, reputational damage, and the irreversible loss of cultural heritage. Careful judgment is required to balance the desire for acquisition with the ethical and legal imperative to protect cultural property. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Historical Commission and consulting relevant legal counsel specializing in cultural heritage law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the procedural requirements and legal obligations mandated by the UNESCO Convention as implemented within Alabama. The Alabama Historical Commission is the designated state authority responsible for overseeing cultural property matters. Consulting with them ensures that any proposed transaction is reviewed against state and federal laws that give effect to the UNESCO Convention, such as the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, ARPA, and potentially state-specific statutes concerning antiquities. Legal counsel provides expertise in interpreting these laws and ensuring all documentation and due diligence are meticulously completed, thereby minimizing the risk of acquiring illicitly trafficked cultural property. This proactive and informed engagement is the most robust method for ensuring compliance and ethical conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the acquisition based solely on the seller's assurances of legitimate provenance, without independent verification or consultation with state authorities. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the critical due diligence required by the UNESCO Convention and its implementing legislation. The convention places a burden on importing states and their citizens to ensure that cultural property is not illicitly exported. Relying solely on seller assurances ignores this responsibility and risks facilitating the trade in stolen or illegally excavated artifacts. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the item is being sold within Alabama, it is automatically compliant with all relevant laws. This is a flawed assumption that overlooks the extraterritorial implications of the UNESCO Convention. Cultural property can be illicitly exported from its country of origin and then enter the stream of commerce in Alabama. The convention requires states parties to take measures to prevent the import of cultural property that has been illegally exported from another state party. Therefore, the origin and export history of the property are paramount, regardless of where it is currently being offered for sale. A further incorrect approach is to prioritize the potential financial gain or the perceived historical significance of the artifact over legal and ethical considerations. This approach is professionally unacceptable, as it demonstrates a disregard for the fundamental principles of cultural heritage protection enshrined in the UNESCO Convention. The Convention's primary aim is to safeguard cultural heritage from illicit trafficking, and this objective must supersede commercial interests or personal desires. Ethical decision-making in this field demands that legal compliance and the protection of heritage are the paramount considerations. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with potential acquisitions of cultural property in Alabama should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes due diligence, legal compliance, and ethical responsibility. This framework involves 1. Identifying the potential cultural significance of the item and its likely origin. 2. Researching relevant international conventions, like the UNESCO Convention, and their specific implementation within Alabama law. 3. Consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission and seeking expert legal advice on cultural heritage law. 4. Conducting thorough provenance research, including verifying export and import documentation. 5. Proceeding with an acquisition only when all legal and ethical requirements are demonstrably met and the risk of illicit trafficking is eliminated. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with the protection of cultural heritage. Question 9. The audit findings indicate that a proposed commercial development project in rural Alabama is slated to occur on land adjacent to a historically significant indigenous burial ground. Project developers have submitted an initial environmental impact report that briefly mentions the proximity of the burial ground, but does not detail specific protocols for engagement with the local indigenous community or outline measures to mitigate potential impacts on the sacred site. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Alabama Historical Commission to recommend to the developers and local authorities? Option A. Advise the developers to proceed with the project as planned, but to include a clause in their construction contracts requiring workers to avoid the immediate vicinity of the burial ground, and to offer a one-time donation to a local indigenous cultural center. Option B. Suggests that the developers obtain an independent appraisal of the land's cultural value and offer a financial settlement to the indigenous community to compensate for any potential disruption or impact on their heritage. Option C. Recommend that the developers conduct a purely archaeological survey of the burial ground to determine its precise boundaries and historical significance, with findings to be submitted to the Commission for review, without direct community engagement at this stage. Option D. Mandate immediate and comprehensive consultation with the recognized tribal council representing the indigenous community to collaboratively develop a culturally sensitive site management plan and mitigation strategy before any further development permits are issued. The correct answer is D. Mandate immediate and comprehensive consultation with the recognized tribal council representing the indigenous community to collaboratively develop a culturally sensitive site management plan and mitigation strategy before any further development permits are issued. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential conflict between a proposed development project and the preservation of significant indigenous cultural heritage sites within Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development interests with the fundamental rights of indigenous communities to protect and maintain their cultural heritage, as enshrined in Alabama law. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests in a manner that is both legally compliant and ethically sound. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with the affected indigenous communities to understand their concerns and to collaboratively develop mitigation strategies that respect their cultural heritage rights. This approach aligns with the principles of cultural resource management and the spirit of Alabama's laws that recognize the importance of preserving cultural heritage for present and future generations. Specifically, Alabama Code Title 41, Chapter 9, Article 10, concerning the Alabama Historical Commission and the protection of historical and archaeological sites, emphasizes consultation and consideration of the impact on cultural resources. Engaging directly with the communities ensures that their perspectives are heard and incorporated into the decision-making process, fostering a more equitable and sustainable outcome. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the development without meaningful consultation, relying solely on a preliminary environmental impact assessment that may not adequately address the cultural significance of the sites to the indigenous communities. This fails to uphold the ethical obligation to respect the rights of indigenous peoples and contravenes the spirit, if not the letter, of Alabama's cultural heritage protection laws, which implicitly require consideration of community impact. Another incorrect approach would be to offer a purely financial compensation package to the indigenous communities as a means to bypass the need for in-depth consultation and site preservation discussions. While compensation might be a component of a broader agreement, it cannot substitute for the recognition of cultural rights and the opportunity for communities to actively participate in decisions affecting their heritage. This approach disregards the intrinsic value of cultural heritage beyond monetary worth and undermines the community's inherent right to self-determination regarding their ancestral lands and cultural practices. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the indigenous community's claims based on the argument that the proposed development offers significant economic benefits to the region. While economic benefits are important, they do not supersede the legal and ethical imperative to protect cultural heritage. Prioritizing economic gain over established cultural heritage rights would be a clear violation of legal obligations and ethical principles. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant Alabama statutes and regulations pertaining to cultural heritage and indigenous rights. This should be followed by a commitment to transparent and inclusive engagement with all affected stakeholders, particularly the indigenous communities. The process should prioritize collaborative problem-solving, seeking solutions that respect cultural values, while also considering legitimate development needs, and ensuring that any decisions are legally defensible and ethically responsible. Question 10. System analysis indicates that a proposed infrastructure project in Alabama may impact a site of significant cultural heritage for a local indigenous community. The Alabama Historical Commission requires an assessment of the economic impact of this cultural heritage on the human rights of the affected community to inform mitigation strategies. If the estimated annual economic value derived from traditional livelihoods directly supported by the site is $150,000, the estimated annual economic value of cultural practices and knowledge transmission linked to the site is $75,000, and the community's well-being index, reflecting social stability and self-determination, is 0.85. What is the calculated economic impact on the human rights of the affected community using the formula? Economic impact equals value of cultural practices plus value of traditional livelihoods plus value of community identity, asterisk community well-being index. Assume value of community identity is implicitly captured within the value of cultural practices for this calculation. Option A, $216, 750. Option B, $195, 500. Option C, $187, 500. Option D, $225, 000. The correct answer is A, $216, 750. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between economic development and the preservation of cultural heritage, which is often tied to the human rights of indigenous communities in Alabama. The Alabama Historical Commission's mandate to protect cultural resources must be balanced against the potential economic benefits of a proposed development. The challenge lies in quantifying the intangible value of cultural heritage and its impact on the human rights of affected communities, particularly when financial compensation is proposed as a mitigation measure. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any mitigation strategy genuinely respects and upholds the rights of these communities, rather than merely offering a financial workaround. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment that quantifies the economic impact of the cultural heritage site on the human rights of the affected indigenous community, using a methodology that accounts for both direct and indirect economic contributions. This includes evaluating the site's role in cultural practices, traditional livelihoods, and community identity, and then translating these into quantifiable economic terms. For instance, if the site is crucial for traditional fishing, the economic value of that fishery, considering its cultural significance and sustainability, would be calculated. The formula for calculating the economic impact of a cultural heritage site on human rights could be conceptualized as economic impact equals value of cultural practices plus value of traditional livelihoods plus value of community identity, asterisk community well-being index, where value of cultural practices, estimated economic value derived from rituals, ceremonies, and knowledge transmission tied to the site, value of traditional livelihoods, quantified economic benefit from activities like farming, hunting, or gathering directly linked to the site's ecological integrity, value of community identity, a qualitative assessment translated into economic terms, reflecting the site's contribution to social cohesion and self-determination. Community Well-Being Index, a metric reflecting the overall health, education, and social stability of the affected community, influenced by the site's preservation. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the prompt's requirement to quantify the impact of cultural heritage law on human rights through an economic lens, as mandated by the Alabama Historical Commission's purview over cultural resources and their impact on communities. It moves beyond simple monetary compensation to consider the multifaceted economic implications of cultural preservation for human rights. Incorrect approaches analysis, offering a fixed monetary compensation based solely on the estimated market value of the land, without considering its cultural significance or impact on community well-being, fails to adequately address the human rights dimension. This approach is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it treats the cultural heritage site as a mere commodity, ignoring its intrinsic value and its role in sustaining the human rights of the indigenous community, such as the right to culture and self-determination. It does not align with the Alabama Historical Commission's responsibility to protect cultural resources in a manner that respects the rights of those connected to them. Proposing mitigation measures that focus exclusively on the physical preservation of artifacts or structures, without assessing the economic impact on the community's human rights, is also insufficient. While physical preservation is important, it does not address the broader economic consequences of losing access to or the integrity of a culturally significant site. This overlooks the economic underpinnings of many human rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living, which can be directly tied to traditional livelihoods dependent on the heritage site. Suggesting that the economic benefits of the proposed development will indirectly benefit the community, thereby offsetting any negative impacts on cultural heritage, is a speculative and potentially harmful approach. This fails to provide a concrete, quantifiable assessment of the impact on human rights and relies on assumptions rather than evidence. It sidesteps the direct responsibility to measure and mitigate the economic consequences of development on the cultural heritage and the associated human rights of the affected community, as required by Alabama law. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a rights-based and economically informed approach. This involves first identifying the specific human rights implicated by the cultural heritage site and the proposed development, then employing a robust methodology to quantify the economic value of the site's contribution to these rights. This quantification should consider both direct economic benefits, e.g., traditional livelihoods, and indirect benefits, e.g., social cohesion, cultural continuity. Finally, mitigation strategies must be developed that are not only financially compensatory, but also demonstrably uphold and enhance the human rights of the affected community, ensuring that economic development does not come at the expense of fundamental rights. Question 11. What factors determine the appropriate level of consultation required with Alabama's indigenous communities when a proposed infrastructure project may impact areas of significant cultural heritage? Option A. The project's overall economic benefit to the state of Alabama, irrespective of potential cultural impacts. Option B. The opinion of the project developer regarding the perceived insignificance of potential cultural impacts. Option C. The potential for the project to affect known or potential indigenous ancestral lands, sacred sites, or traditional cultural properties, as identified through consultation with Alabama tribal historic preservation offices and indigenous community representatives. Option D. The existence of general historical records indicating past indigenous presence in the broader region. The correct answer is C. The potential for the project to affect known or potential indigenous ancestral lands, sacred sites, or traditional cultural properties, as identified through consultation with Alabama tribal historic preservation offices and indigenous community representatives. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the potential economic benefits of development with the fundamental cultural rights and heritage of indigenous peoples in Alabama. Misinterpreting or disregarding these rights can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and the irreversible loss of invaluable cultural assets. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law and ethical considerations regarding indigenous heritage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the relevant Alabama Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, THPO, and indigenous community leaders early in the planning process. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the principles enshrined in Alabama's cultural heritage laws and federal guidelines that mandate consultation with indigenous peoples regarding projects that may affect their ancestral lands and cultural resources. Such engagement allows for the identification of potential impacts, the exploration of mitigation strategies, and the incorporation of indigenous perspectives into project design, thereby respecting their cultural rights and ensuring legal compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with development plans based solely on state environmental impact assessments without direct consultation with indigenous communities. This fails to acknowledge the specific legal and ethical obligations to consult with THPO and indigenous groups, potentially violating their cultural rights and leading to legal challenges under Alabama and federal law. Another incorrect approach is to only engage with indigenous communities after significant project milestones have been reached or construction has begun. This demonstrates a lack of good faith consultation, disrespects indigenous cultural rights, and can result in costly project delays, redesigns, and legal disputes, as it bypasses the opportunity for collaborative problem solving. A further incorrect approach is to rely on general historical records or non-indigenous expert opinions to assess potential impacts on indigenous cultural heritage, without seeking direct input from the affected indigenous peoples themselves. This approach ignores the living cultural knowledge and perspectives of indigenous communities, which are paramount in understanding and protecting their heritage, and contravenes the spirit and letter of laws protecting indigenous rights. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes early, meaningful, and ongoing consultation with indigenous communities and their designated representatives. This involves understanding the specific legal requirements in Alabama concerning cultural heritage and indigenous rights, conducting thorough due diligence to identify potentially affected indigenous groups, and establishing clear communication channels. The process should be iterative, allowing for feedback and adaptation of plans based on indigenous concerns and knowledge. Transparency and a commitment to respecting indigenous self-determination are crucial throughout the project lifecycle. Question 12. The control framework reveals that a proposed infrastructure development project in rural Alabama may have potential impacts on areas identified as having historical significance to local Native American tribes, including concerns about the preservation of traditional land, use practices, and sacred sites. Which approach to assessing these potential impacts best aligns with Alabama's cultural heritage protection obligations and the principles of human rights for indigenous peoples? Option A. Implement standard archaeological mitigation measures based on general historical data without consulting tribes on their specific cultural values or concerns. Option B. Rely on a general environmental impact assessment that broadly categorizes historical sites without specific engagement with tribal communities. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive cultural heritage impact assessment that includes direct, early, and ongoing consultation with potentially affected Native American tribes to identify and address impacts on their traditional cultural properties and intangible heritage. Option D. Proceed with the project after a preliminary assessment that concludes potential impacts are minor, without seeking direct input from tribal representatives. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive cultural heritage impact assessment that includes direct, early, and ongoing consultation with potentially affected Native American tribes to identify and address impacts on their traditional cultural properties and intangible heritage. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex interplay between development projects and the preservation of Alabama's cultural heritage, particularly concerning potential impacts on sites of significance to Native American tribes. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development with the legal and ethical obligation to protect intangible cultural heritage and the rights of indigenous peoples, as enshrined in Alabama law and federal guidelines that inform state practice. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the impact assessment process is thorough, respectful, and compliant with all applicable regulations. The best approach involves conducting a comprehensive cultural heritage impact assessment that specifically identifies and consults with potentially affected Native American tribes regarding their traditional cultural properties and intangible heritage. This approach is correct because Alabama law, in conjunction with federal principles like those found in the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, which often guides state-level practices, mandates consultation with tribes when projects may affect sites of cultural or religious importance. This proactive and inclusive assessment ensures that tribal perspectives are integrated into the decision-making process, allowing for mitigation measures to be developed collaboratively and respecting the inherent rights of tribes to their cultural heritage. An approach that solely relies on a general environmental impact assessment without specific tribal consultation is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the specific legal and ethical requirements for identifying and addressing impacts on cultural heritage, particularly those of indigenous peoples. It overlooks the unique nature of intangible cultural heritage and the distinct rights and concerns of Native American tribes, thereby risking violations of consultation mandates and potentially leading to the irreversible damage of culturally significant sites or practices. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to proceed with the project based on a preliminary assessment that dismisses potential impacts without engaging directly with tribal representatives. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the spirit and letter of consultation requirements, which necessitate meaningful engagement. Such an approach prioritizes expediency over legal compliance and ethical responsibility, potentially leading to significant legal challenges and reputational damage. A further professionally unacceptable approach is to implement mitigation measures without prior tribal consent or input. While mitigation is a crucial part of impact assessment, it must be developed in partnership with the affected communities. Implementing measures unilaterally disregards tribal sovereignty and their right to determine how their cultural heritage is protected, rendering the mitigation efforts potentially ineffective or even culturally inappropriate. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a tiered approach. First, identifying all potential cultural heritage resources, including intangible aspects, within the project's area of potential effect. Second, determining which of these resources may be affected by the project. Third, initiating early and ongoing consultation with potentially affected Native American tribes, respecting their protocols and knowledge systems. Fourth, developing a comprehensive impact assessment that incorporates tribal input and identifies potential adverse effects. Finally, collaboratively developing and implementing appropriate mitigation and management plans that are respectful of tribal rights and cultural heritage. Question 13. Governance review demonstrates that a large-scale land development project in Mobile County, Alabama, has uncovered several historically significant artifacts during preliminary excavation. The project developers are eager to proceed quickly and have presented documentation suggesting the artifacts were found on private land. What is the most responsible and legally compliant approach to managing these discovered cultural artifacts in accordance with Alabama cultural heritage law? Option A. Initiate a thorough provenance investigation for each artifact, consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission and relevant experts to ensure legal acquisition and to prevent any involvement in the illicit trade or trafficking of cultural property. Option B. Proceed with the development, assuming the artifacts are legally owned by the landowners and can be managed or sold as private property without further inquiry. Option C. Rely solely on the developer's assurances and provided documentation regarding the artifact's origin and legality, and continue with the development timeline. Option D. Immediately contact a private auction house to appraise and facilitate the sale of the artifacts, as they were found on private property. The correct answer is A. Initiate a thorough provenance investigation for each artifact, consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission and relevant experts to ensure legal acquisition and to prevent any involvement in the illicit trade or trafficking of cultural property. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic benefits of a proposed development with the long-term imperative of protecting Alabama's cultural heritage from illicit trade and trafficking. The potential for significant financial gain can create pressure to overlook or downplay risks associated with the provenance of artifacts. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law and ethical standards concerning cultural property. The best professional approach involves a proactive and thorough due diligence process focused on verifying the legal acquisition and provenance of any cultural property identified during the survey. This includes consulting with experts, reviewing documentation, and, if necessary, engaging with relevant Alabama historical commissions or law enforcement agencies to confirm that the artifacts are not subject to claims of illicit origin or trafficking under Alabama Code Title 41, Chapter 8. Alabama Historical Commission. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical stewardship, mitigating the risk of inadvertently facilitating or benefiting from the illicit trade of cultural property. An approach that prioritizes immediate development and assumes the legality of all discovered artifacts without independent verification is professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct due diligence directly contravenes the spirit and letter of Alabama's laws designed to protect its cultural heritage. It risks implicating the project in the illicit trade of cultural property, leading to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and the irreversible loss of historical artifacts for the state. Another unacceptable approach is to solely rely on the assurances of the land developer or contractor regarding the origin of any discovered items. This abdication of responsibility ignores the professional obligation to independently assess the provenance and legality of cultural property. It creates a significant ethical and legal vulnerability, as the project could be held liable for the actions of third parties if those actions involve the illicit trade of artifacts. Finally, an approach that involves immediately reporting all discovered artifacts to a private auction house for valuation and potential sale, without first establishing their legal provenance and compliance with Alabama's cultural heritage laws, is also professionally unsound. This bypasses crucial legal and ethical steps, potentially leading to the dispersal of illegally obtained or trafficked cultural property, and exposing the project to legal repercussions. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the legal landscape governing cultural property in Alabama. This involves identifying potential risks associated with the discovery of artifacts, such as the possibility of them being stolen, illegally excavated, or otherwise trafficked. The framework should then mandate a rigorous due diligence process, including expert consultation and documentation review, to establish clear provenance. If any doubt or red flags arise, the framework must dictate escalation to appropriate state authorities for guidance and resolution, ensuring that all actions align with Alabama's commitment to preserving its cultural heritage. Question 14. The monitoring system demonstrates an unusual increase in military training exercises near a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site within Alabama, raising concerns about potential damage to irreplaceable cultural artifacts. What is the most professionally responsible course of action for the Alabama Historical Commission to take? Option A. Immediately notify the United States Department of State and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, of the observed activity and request their guidance and intervention. Option B. Contact the commanding officer of the military unit conducting the exercises to request they relocate their training activities. Option C. Advise local law enforcement to increase patrols in the vicinity of the heritage site to deter any accidental damage. Option D. Issue a public statement expressing concern, but await further developments before taking any formal action. Correct answer is A. Immediately notify the United States Department of State and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, of the observed activity and request their guidance and intervention. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a potential violation of Alabama's commitment to protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict, specifically concerning the principles enshrined in the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of international law as it applies to state obligations, balancing military necessity with the imperative to safeguard irreplaceable cultural assets. The Alabama Historical Commission, tasked with overseeing such matters, must act decisively and ethically to prevent irreversible damage. The most appropriate approach involves immediate notification and consultation with relevant international and federal bodies. This entails formally reporting the observed activity to the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and the United States Department of State, as these entities are central to the implementation and oversight of the Hague Convention. This approach is correct because it aligns with Alabama's obligations under the Convention, which emphasizes international cooperation and the reporting of potential threats to cultural property. It ensures that the matter is addressed through established diplomatic and legal channels, allowing for coordinated international action and expert assessment of the situation. This proactive engagement respects the spirit and letter of the Convention by prioritizing the protection of cultural heritage through collaborative efforts. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on local law enforcement without engaging international frameworks. While local authorities have a role in maintaining order, they may lack the specific expertise or mandate to address violations of international cultural heritage law. This failure to involve relevant international bodies bypasses the established mechanisms for dispute resolution and protection under the Hague Convention, potentially leading to inadequate or inappropriate responses. Another unacceptable approach is to dismiss the observations as a minor issue without further investigation or reporting. This demonstrates a disregard for Alabama's international commitments and the profound significance of cultural property. The Hague Convention mandates a proactive stance in protecting heritage, and inaction in the face of potential threats constitutes a significant ethical and legal failure. Finally, attempting to unilaterally intervene or impose local sanctions without consulting or informing international bodies is also professionally unsound. Such actions could complicate diplomatic efforts, undermine international cooperation, and potentially lead to unintended consequences that further endanger the cultural property. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes adherence to international legal obligations, seeks expert consultation, and utilizes established reporting mechanisms. This involves recognizing the gravity of potential threats to cultural heritage, understanding the specific legal frameworks in place, like the Hague Convention, and acting collaboratively with relevant national and international authorities to ensure the most effective protection. Question 15. Governance review demonstrates that during routine site preparation for a new commercial development in Mobile, Alabama, construction crews have unearthed what appear to be significant historical artifacts and structural remnants. The project manager, aware of potential delays, is considering immediate next steps. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the project manager to take in Alabama? Option A. Immediately halt all ground-disturbing activities in the vicinity of the discovery and formally notify the Alabama Historical Commission. Option B. Conduct a preliminary assessment of the artifact's condition and potential value with the on-site foreman before deciding on further action. Option C. Engage a local historical society for an informal opinion on the significance of the unearthed items. Option D. Continue construction in unaffected areas of the site, while initiating a private consultation with a historical preservation firm to assess the impact. The correct answer is A. Immediately halt all ground-disturbing activities in the vicinity of the discovery and formally notify the Alabama Historical Commission. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a development project with the long-term, often intangible, cultural and historical significance of an archaeological find within Alabama. The pressure to proceed with development can create a conflict of interest, necessitating a rigorous adherence to legal and ethical obligations to protect heritage. The discovery's potential significance, coupled with the developer's timeline, demands careful judgment and a proactive, legally compliant approach. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately halting any ground-disturbing activities that could impact the find and notifying the Alabama Historical Commission (AHC), as mandated by Alabama law. This approach prioritizes compliance with the Alabama Antiquities Act, which grant the AHC authority over the discovery and preservation of archaeological sites on state lands, or those impacting state interests. Prompt notification ensures that the AHC can conduct its own assessment, determine the significance of the find, and prescribe appropriate mitigation or preservation measures, thereby fulfilling the state's legal duty to protect its cultural heritage. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the development after a cursory visual inspection by the site supervisor without formal notification fails to acknowledge the potential legal requirements for archaeological discoveries in Alabama. This approach risks violating the Alabama Antiquities Act and could lead to the irreversible destruction of significant cultural resources, incurring legal penalties and reputational damage. Contacting a private archaeological consultant for an immediate assessment and report without involving the AHC first, while seemingly proactive, bypasses the statutory authority of the state agency. The Alabama Antiquities Act designates the AHC as the primary body responsible for evaluating and managing such discoveries. This approach could lead to a report that does not meet the AHC's requirements or may be disregarded, delaying proper legal compliance. Delaying notification to the AHC until the developer has secured alternative project plans or assessed the economic impact of a potential halt is ethically and legally unsound. This approach prioritizes financial considerations over legal obligations and the preservation of cultural heritage, directly contravening the spirit and letter of Alabama's heritage protection laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first understand the specific legal framework governing cultural heritage in the relevant jurisdiction, in this case, Alabama. They must then prioritize legal compliance and ethical responsibility over immediate project pressures. A structured approach involves 1. Recognizing the potential significance of the discovery and its implications under state law. 2. Immediately ceasing any activities that could disturb the find. 3. Consulting the relevant state agency, the Alabama Historical Commission, as per statutory requirements. 4. Cooperating fully with the agency's directives and recommendations. This process ensures that legal obligations are met, cultural heritage is appropriately managed, and potential liabilities are minimized. Question 16. Governance review demonstrates that the Alabama Historical Commission is evaluating a proposed infrastructure project. Which approach best fulfills the Commission's mandate to protect Alabama's cultural heritage while considering the project's potential impacts? Option A. Relying exclusively on previously conducted but potentially outdated surveys of the project area to identify cultural heritage resources. Option B. Conducting a comprehensive, multidisciplinary impact assessment that includes new field surveys, historical research, and broad stakeholder consultation to identify and evaluate potential adverse effects on cultural heritage resources. Option C. Limiting public consultation to direct landowners adjacent to the proposed project footprint and excluding broader community or tribal input. Option D. Prioritizing the project's economic benefits and expediting the approval process, addressing cultural heritage concerns only if they become significant obstacles. The correct answer is B. Conducting a comprehensive, multidisciplinary impact assessment that includes new field surveys, historical research, and broad stakeholder consultation to identify and evaluate potential adverse effects on cultural heritage resources. Explanation. Governance review demonstrates that the Alabama Historical Commission (AHC) is tasked with assessing the potential impact of a proposed new highway expansion project on significant cultural heritage sites within the state. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the state's infrastructure development needs with the imperative to protect irreplaceable historical and archaeological resources, demanding careful judgment to ensure compliance with Alabama law and ethical stewardship of cultural heritage. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive, multidisciplinary impact assessment that prioritizes the identification and evaluation of potential adverse effects on documented and potential cultural heritage resources. This includes thorough archaeological surveys, historical research into the significance of affected areas, and consultation with relevant stakeholders, including tribal nations, local historical societies, and the public. The AHC's role, as defined by Alabama Code Title 41, Chapter 9, is to preserve and protect Alabama's historical, architectural, and archaeological resources. Therefore, a rigorous assessment that adheres to established archaeological and historical preservation standards and proactively seeks to mitigate or avoid negative impacts aligns directly with the AHC's statutory mandate and ethical obligations. This approach ensures that decisions are informed by robust data and a commitment to long-term preservation. An approach that relies solely on existing, potentially outdated survey data without conducting new field investigations is professionally unacceptable. This fails to account for newly discovered sites or changes in the landscape that might affect heritage resources, thereby violating the principle of thorough due diligence required by Alabama heritage law. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize the economic benefits of the highway expansion over any identified cultural heritage concerns without a detailed mitigation plan. This disregards the intrinsic value of cultural heritage and the legal protections afforded to it under Alabama law, which mandates consideration of such impacts. Finally, an approach that involves minimal public consultation, focusing only on direct property owners, is also professionally flawed. Alabama heritage laws often emphasize public interest in cultural resources. An effective stewardship requires broader engagement to understand community values and concerns, and to ensure transparency in the decision-making process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the legal and ethical obligations. This involves identifying all relevant stakeholders, thoroughly assessing potential impacts using best available science and historical research, exploring all feasible avoidance and mitigation strategies, and engaging in transparent communication throughout the process. The ultimate goal is to achieve a balance that allows for necessary development, while ensuring the responsible preservation of Alabama's cultural heritage for future generations. Question 17. Market research demonstrates a growing interest in acquiring artifacts with potential ties to Alabama's historical and indigenous past. A dealer in Alabama is presented with an opportunity to purchase a collection of pottery shards and stone tools that the seller claims were found on private land within the state. The seller provides a handwritten note stating the items were discovered some years ago, but offers no further documentation regarding the exact location of discovery, the landowner's permission at the time, or any permits that may have been required. What is the most prudent legal and ethical approach for the dealer to take in Alabama? Option A. Focus solely on the potential market value and aesthetic appeal of the artifacts, as their historical significance and origin are secondary to their commercial viability in Alabama. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition, relying on the seller's assurance that the items were found on private land within Alabama, as this generally implies legal possession. Option C. Conduct thorough due diligence, including attempting to verify the seller's claims about the discovery location and landowner permission, and consult with legal counsel specializing in cultural heritage law if any uncertainties persist before proceeding with the acquisition. Option D. Acquire the items immediately to secure them, assuming that any legal issues can be resolved later if they arise, given the items are currently within Alabama. The correct answer is C. Conduct thorough due diligence, including attempting to verify the seller's claims about the discovery location and landowner permission, and consult with legal counsel specializing in cultural heritage law if any uncertainties persist before proceeding with the acquisition. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the complex legal landscape of illicit trade in cultural heritage artifacts within Alabama. The challenge lies in identifying and applying the correct legal frameworks to prevent the acquisition and disposition of items that may have been illegally excavated or exported, thereby protecting Alabama's cultural patrimony. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between legitimate trade and activities that violate state and federal laws, ensuring compliance and ethical conduct. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive approach of conducting thorough due diligence and seeking legal counsel when there is any doubt about the provenance of cultural heritage items. This approach directly addresses the core of the legal framework by prioritizing compliance with Alabama's laws and relevant federal statutes like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, ARPA, as well as international conventions ratified by the United States. It involves verifying ownership, origin, and legal export status, and if any red flags are identified, refraining from the transaction or consulting with legal experts specializing in cultural heritage law. This aligns with the ethical obligation to prevent the illicit trade and protect cultural property. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with a transaction based solely on the seller's assurances of legitimacy without independent verification. This fails to acknowledge the inherent risks associated with the illicit antiquities market and directly contravenes the due diligence requirements mandated by the legal framework. It exposes the professional to potential legal penalties, including fines and forfeiture of goods, and contributes to the erosion of cultural heritage. Another incorrect approach is to assume that if an item is offered for sale within Alabama, it is automatically legal to trade. This overlooks the extraterritorial reach of certain laws and the fact that items may have been illegally removed from other states or countries and then brought into Alabama. Legal framework requires an understanding of the entire chain of custody and origin, not just the current location of the item. A further incorrect approach is to rely on the perceived antiquity or aesthetic value of an item as a sole determinant of its legality. While these factors might be relevant in assessing an item's cultural significance, they do not substitute for legal provenance. The law is concerned with the lawful acquisition and movement of cultural property, regardless of its perceived artistic merit or age. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a risk-based approach to due diligence. When considering the acquisition or sale of cultural heritage items, they should first identify potential risks associated with the item's origin, history, and the circumstances of its offering. This involves researching the item's known provenance, checking against databases of stolen or illicitly traded artifacts, and understanding the relevant legal protections for cultural property in Alabama and at the federal level. If any uncertainty or potential legal issue arises, the professional should pause the transaction and seek expert legal advice to ensure full compliance with all applicable laws and ethical standards. Question 18. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a proposed commercial development in Mobile County, Alabama, may impact areas with potential historical significance. Considering Alabama's specific legislative framework for cultural heritage protection, which of the following approaches best addresses the potential impact on cultural resources? Option A. Proceed with development if no officially listed historic sites are present within the immediate project footprint, assuming no significant cultural resources exist. Option B. Conduct a brief visual inspection of the project site for any obvious above-ground historical structures, deeming further investigation unnecessary if none are found. Option C. Rely on anecdotal information from long-term local residents about the area's history to guide development decisions, without formal surveys or consultation with the Alabama Historical Commission. Option D. Engage qualified historical and archaeological consultants to conduct a comprehensive cultural resource survey of the project area, adhering to the Alabama Historical Commission's guidelines, and prepare a detailed impact assessment for review and consultation with the Commission. The correct answer is D. Engage qualified historical and archaeological consultants to conduct a comprehensive cultural resource survey of the project area, adhering to the Alabama Historical Commission's guidelines, and prepare a detailed impact assessment for review and consultation with the Commission. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development with the preservation of significant cultural resources, a common tension in Alabama's rapidly growing areas. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and assessing the potential impact of a proposed development on sites that may hold historical or cultural importance to the state, even if not yet formally recognized under federal or state historic preservation laws. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's specific cultural heritage legislation and to avoid irreversible damage to the state's patrimony. The best approach involves conducting a thorough cultural resource survey by qualified professionals. This survey should adhere to the standards and guidelines established by the Alabama Historical Commission, as mandated by state law. The survey's purpose is to identify any potential archaeological sites, historic structures, or other cultural resources within the project's area of potential effect. Following the survey, a formal impact assessment should be prepared, detailing any identified resources and proposing mitigation strategies in consultation with the Alabama Historical Commission. This proactive and legally compliant method ensures that potential impacts are understood and addressed before construction begins, aligning with the state's commitment to preserving its heritage. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with development based solely on the absence of previously documented historic sites. This fails to acknowledge that many sites may be undiscovered and that state law requires consideration of potential impacts, not just documented ones. It bypasses the legally mandated survey process and risks damaging or destroying unrecorded cultural resources, violating the spirit and letter of Alabama's cultural heritage laws. Another unacceptable approach is to rely on informal consultations with local community members without engaging qualified historical or archaeological experts, and without following the formal review processes outlined by the Alabama Historical Commission. While community input is valuable, it cannot substitute for a professional, systematic assessment required by state law. This approach risks overlooking significant resources or misinterpreting their importance, leading to potential legal and ethical breaches. Finally, a flawed approach would be to conduct a superficial survey that only looks for obvious, above-ground structures, ignoring potential subsurface archaeological deposits. Alabama's cultural heritage includes significant archaeological sites that may not be visually apparent. This limited scope of investigation fails to meet the comprehensive requirements of a cultural resource survey under state law and could lead to the inadvertent destruction of invaluable historical information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and best practices in cultural resource management. This involves understanding the specific requirements of Alabama's cultural heritage laws, engaging qualified professionals for surveys and assessments, consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission early and often, and developing a clear plan for mitigation if impacts are identified. The process should be transparent and documented to ensure accountability and responsible stewardship of Alabama's cultural heritage. Question 19. The performance metrics show a significant increase in inquiries regarding the provenance and ownership of historical artifacts discovered on private land within Alabama. A collector in Mobile, Alabama, has recently come into possession of what appears to be a pre-Columbian pottery shard, which they acquired through a private estate sale. However, a local historical society has contacted the collector, asserting that the shard may be a significant cultural heritage item and that they have historical documentation suggesting it was part of a collection that was improperly dispersed. The collector is unsure how to proceed to definitively establish their rightful ownership under Alabama law. Option A. Publicly announce the discovery and invite any potential claimants to present their evidence directly to the collector for informal review. Option B. Secure the artifact and await further contact from the historical society without taking any proactive legal steps. Option C. Immediately offer to sell the artifact to the historical society at a negotiated price to avoid further complications. Option D. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama property and cultural heritage law to initiate a formal legal action, such as a declaratory judgment or quiet title action, to have a court determine rightful ownership based on presented evidence and relevant Alabama statutes. The correct answer is D. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama property and cultural heritage law to initiate a formal legal action, such as a declaratory judgment or quiet title action, to have a court determine rightful ownership based on presented evidence and relevant Alabama statutes. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a complex ownership dispute over a potentially significant cultural artifact, requiring careful navigation of Alabama's specific heritage laws and ethical considerations regarding provenance and rightful ownership. The presence of conflicting claims necessitates a thorough and legally sound approach to avoid legal repercussions and uphold ethical standards in handling cultural property. The best approach involves initiating a formal legal process to establish clear title. This means engaging legal counsel specializing in Alabama property and cultural heritage law to file an action for declaratory judgment or quiet title. This process allows a court to definitively determine ownership based on presented evidence, such as historical documentation, purchase records, and any applicable Alabama statutes concerning cultural artifacts. This is the correct approach because it utilizes the established legal framework within Alabama to resolve ownership disputes, providing a definitive and legally binding resolution. It respects the rights of all potential claimants by offering them a formal avenue to present their case before a neutral arbiter, adhering to due process and the principles of Alabama law governing property rights and cultural heritage. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally claim ownership based on possession alone. This fails to acknowledge the potential rights of other claimants and bypasses the legal mechanisms designed to resolve such disputes. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, requires more than mere possession to establish definitive title, especially when dealing with items of potential cultural significance. This approach risks legal challenges and potential liability for wrongful possession or conversion. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to mediate a private settlement without involving legal counsel or a formal legal process. While informal resolution can sometimes be effective, in cases of disputed ownership of potentially valuable cultural heritage items in Alabama, this can lead to an unenforceable agreement or one that does not fully address the legal requirements for title transfer under Alabama law. It also fails to provide the certainty and legal protection that a court-ordered resolution offers. A further incorrect approach would be to dispose of the artifact without resolving the ownership dispute. This is highly problematic as it could be construed as destruction or concealment of evidence, or conversion of property that rightfully belongs to another. Alabama law provides specific remedies for wrongful disposition of property, and this action would likely exacerbate any existing legal claims and create new ones. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the dispute and the potential legal and ethical implications. 2. Consulting with legal experts familiar with the relevant jurisdiction's laws, in this case, Alabama cultural heritage and property law. 3. Understanding the available legal avenues for dispute resolution. 4. Gathering all relevant documentation and evidence. 5. Acting in a manner that respects the rights of all parties and upholds the integrity of the legal process. Question 20. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a significant collection of potentially historically valuable artifacts has been identified within a designated conflict zone in Alabama. Due to ongoing hostilities, immediate extraction poses a substantial risk to personnel. However, the site is increasingly vulnerable to damage or looting. The estimated replacement value of the artifacts, if they were to be lost or destroyed, is $5,000,000. The estimated cost for a secure, temporary relocation and storage facility within Alabama, including trained personnel for extraction and transport, is $750,000. The probability of the artifacts being damaged or destroyed if left in situ is estimated at 60% per week. The probability of injury or fatality to extraction personnel during a single extraction attempt is estimated at 15%. Given these parameters, and prioritizing the safety of personnel while seeking to mitigate the loss of cultural heritage, which of the following approaches represents the most prudent course of action under Alabama's cultural heritage protection principles? Option A. Prioritize the immediate extraction of all identified artifacts, accepting the 15% risk of personnel injury or fatality per attempt to prevent any potential loss, regardless of the cost or the specific cultural significance of each item. Option B. Implement immediate, low-risk in situ protective measures if feasible and safe, such as basic site security and detailed photographic and videographic documentation, while simultaneously initiating planning for a phased, risk-mitigated extraction if the security situation improves or if a window of opportunity arises, prioritizing the most significant items first. Option C. Immediately abandon the site and all artifacts due to the high risk to personnel, focusing solely on reporting the situation to relevant authorities without any attempt at on-site intervention. Option D. Attempt to secure the site using improvised, minimal-cost measures that do not involve personnel entering the immediate vicinity, and then wait for the conflict to subside before any further action, even if the probability of damage to the artifacts increases significantly over time. The correct answer is B. Implement immediate, low-risk in situ protective measures if feasible and safe, such as basic site security and detailed photographic and videographic documentation, while simultaneously initiating planning for a phased, risk-mitigated extraction if the security situation improves or if a window of opportunity arises, prioritizing the most significant items first. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate operational needs with the long-term preservation of cultural heritage under extreme duress. The presence of potentially valuable artifacts in a conflict zone necessitates a rapid, yet legally compliant decision-making process. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk to the heritage items versus the risk to personnel and the feasibility of extraction, all within the framework of Alabama's specific cultural heritage protection laws, which may not have explicit provisions for such extreme circumstances, but rely on broader principles of preservation and due diligence. The calculation of potential loss and the cost-benefit analysis of different protective measures are critical. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes the safety of personnel, while implementing a tiered strategy for heritage protection based on risk assessment and resource availability. This approach begins with immediate, low-impact protective measures that do not endanger personnel, such as documenting the items in situ and securing the immediate area if feasible and safe. If resources and security permit, a more involved extraction and relocation to a secure, pre-identified facility within Alabama would be considered. The calculation here involves estimating the potential loss value of the artifacts if they were to be damaged or destroyed, and comparing it against the cost and risk of extraction and relocation. For instance, if the estimated value of a collection of artifacts is \V and the cost of extraction and secure storage is \C with a probability of damage \PD the expected loss is /E loss equals V times PD If /C is significantly less than /E loss and the risk to personnel is acceptable, extraction becomes a viable option. This aligns with the general duty of care under Alabama law to preserve historical and cultural resources. Even if specific conflict zone protocols are absent, the legal justification stems from the inherent value placed on cultural heritage and the responsibility to act prudently to prevent its irreversible loss when possible. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately abandon all artifacts due to the perceived danger, without any attempt at documentation or minimal protection. This fails to uphold the spirit of cultural heritage preservation and represents a dereliction of duty if any safe, low-risk actions could have been taken. Ethically, it prioritizes expediency over the long-term value of irreplaceable cultural assets. Legally, while not explicitly criminalized in this specific scenario, it could be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting heritage resources under Alabama's broader preservation mandates. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the extraction of all artifacts regardless of their cultural significance or the risk involved. This could lead to unnecessary endangerment of personnel and the potential loss of items with minimal historical or cultural value, diverting resources from more critical preservation efforts. The calculation here would be flawed if it did not incorporate a weighted value of the artifacts or a rigorous risk assessment. This approach ignores the principle of proportionality and responsible resource allocation, which are implicit in effective heritage management. A third incorrect approach is to attempt extraction without proper documentation or a clear plan for secure storage, potentially leading to further damage or loss during transit or upon arrival. This demonstrates a lack of professional planning and execution, undermining the very goal of preservation. The mathematical failure here would be in not accounting for the logistical complexities and the associated risks, leading to an incomplete cost-benefit analysis. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Immediate threat assessment to personnel and heritage items. 2. In situ assessment of heritage items' significance and vulnerability. 3. Evaluation of available resources and logistical capabilities for protection or extraction. 4. Calculation of potential loss versus cost and risk of intervention, using formulas like expected loss. 5. Prioritization of actions based on safety, feasibility, and impact. 6. Adherence to all applicable Alabama laws and ethical guidelines for cultural heritage preservation, adapting them to the specific, challenging circumstances.